Hey guys, what's up? So, I want to welcome Mr. Jonathan Henderson to our conversation. Mr. Henderson has over 20 years teaching experience spanning middle school, high school, and university classes. He studied history at the graduate level at Cambridge University, and in 2011, taught in Central Asia as a U.S. State Department Fellow. In 2007, he was a Fulbright Scholar to China and has since spent time in Korea and Japan on study grants, and he's been teaching AP World History since 2002, and he's been a reader for the exam since 2008. Mr. Henderson, welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on and share your insight with us today.
No, it's my pleasure. I'm glad to be here on Quaranteaching.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. So we've been reading and discussing Macbeth as an advanced composition course for the past few weeks, and we're just at this juncture where we're finishing the play, and we talked a little bit about the historical context of what would have motivated Shakespeare in this time period to write this. We do know that it was written in 1606. So we're talking early 17th century Scotland is really this area that we're looking at. And wanted to see if maybe you could offer some insight into some things that might be going on in that time period, and see if we can kind of elevate some historical context to the ultimate creation of the tragedy of Macbeth.
Yeah, so this is a really complicated era in the history of the English monarchy. So what you have here is two separate kingdoms. England was a kingdom and Scotland was a kingdom. And the monarch of England is very well known, Elizabeth I. She was the daughter of Henry VIII. And Elizabeth I enjoyed rule over England at a time when there was this incredible cultural outburst. This Elizabethan age gets its name from her. And what happened was, the Queen of England, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded, and Elizabeth had a little bit something to do with that. So towards the end of her life, maybe perhaps to atone for her sins, when she died, she wanted Mary's son, James, to be the next monarch. Now, James was a Scottish king, and what that meant was England and Scotland for the first time would be united under one kingdom. So this was a huge deal in England. Suddenly you had these people from Scotland, which they considered just wild frontier, out of civilization era, was coming in and becoming part of England. And there was a lot of wonder about what life was like up there. Now the English themselves, there was a witch hysteria in England, so they weren't completely enlightened and rational yet, but even the English considered the Scots extremely superstitious. They thought there was an enormous amount of superstition and witchcraft and other things going on up there. And if you haven't already, you'll probably see that evident in the play.
Yeah, very much so. We've had some conversations already about the supernatural elements that are embedded throughout the play, and really it's this overwhelming theme that occurs throughout its entirety: this supernatural, this witchcraft, this kind of dichotomy of fate versus free will, and we're about at that juncture in our conversations to have some conversations with the witches and the role that they play in Macbeth's fate. We know that it's the tragedy of Macbeth, but ultimately they're almost toying with his life, so to speak, where they're giving him this insight into his fate and things that are going to transpire. And as a result, it's up to Macbeth with how he interprets that information. And we know very early on in the play, he interprets it, with he's very rational with how he takes that information and he thinks through it. They tell him, ultimately that he will become King of Scotland. All hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor. He is currently Thane of Glamis in that area, but the Thane of Cawdor at that juncture, he was still alive. And so he takes that information with a grain of salt because, what they're telling him, he doesn't see any facet of truth to that coming to fruition. But ultimately, when Ross and Lennox show up and share the information that the Thane of Cawdor was traitorous and he is now the new Thane of Cawdor, it almost plants that seed that, maybe him coming to the kingship and usurping the throne is actually something that's going to happen. And so we have talked a little bit about the supernatural components And more so when we first started the play, we looked at this written in the early 17th century. Shakespeare was heavily influenced by the new king, King James, who had just taken over in 1603. And I'm glad you brought up the historical context of this witchcraft and supernatural that was kind of enveloping the area in that time period, because it seems that that's kind of the flavor of the week. And so in your assessment, do you think that Shakespeare was trying to appeal not only to the supernatural that King James would have enjoyed, but also the fact that this is something that was a mindset that was pretty prevalent in that time period?
Yes, I do. I do. And the beauty of Shakespeare, the genius of Shakespeare, I think, is that the themes in his plays are transcendent. He has enormous, incredible psychological insights and political insights that transcend any historical time period, yet he does situate these things in time periods. If you think, for example, about Julius Caesar. But with this one, with Scotland having just been brought into the English kingdom, there's going to be an enormous amount of interest about what Scotland's like. And also, England has a new king who is not English. That's very important. So I think you can see Shakespeare as a genius writer, but also, he's a commercial writer too.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, because we mentioned, um, his genius and his prowess with writing is, it's far beyond the simple entertainment value. He would often use his plays as a methodology to comment on historical things and societal norms that were going on in the time period, and it kind of gave him a voice on stage, and to use that opportunity to share his insights with that. And we've talked about how, especially in regard to King James and appealing to these supernatural effects, Shakespeare isn't just an entertainer. Yes, he wrote for the sake of entertainment and for his love of writing. But at the same juncture, we have to remember that this was his occupation. This was his job. This was his way of making a living. And as a result, it was important, I think, for him to appeal to this newfound king, especially because of the power that he embodies. Right? If the king were to go to the theater and watch all of this unfold, and not be entertained or be almost flabbergasted and taken back by what's transpiring on stage, if he were to go out and share that insight, then the commoners that were looking up to this royal individual that did not like this play, they would be influenced very similarly to how we're influenced today, where we've got celebrities using their platforms to share their opinions on certain things, and as a result, that trickles down to the average individual. And I think the same thing is happening here with Shakespeare. And the fact that he wrote this to appease King James, he knew ultimately that would come about selling more tickets, and this is his livelihood. And I say tickets, that's a much more contemporary
Yeah.
jargon that we use. But can you comment a little bit about the battle of the clans that were going on in this time period that might have had some influence on Shakespeare's composition of Macbeth, particularly in the year that he had written it?
Yeah, Scotland had been characterized by very powerful family clans that were territorial, and there had been centuries of fighting, battle between well-known clans. So there was instability there. What's interesting as well is that Shakespeare, the characters here are of course real. They're embedded in Scottish history, and the Scots would have known about all this several centuries before Shakespeare was writing. This goes back to what, the 12th century?
Yeah, early-ish 11th century. Yeah.
So several centuries before. So he's
Mhm.
making these appeals to things that the Scottish would have known. I'm sure that this enamored him, the king of him, and then also provided English and insight into Scotland to see a different picture than probably the rumors and the battles. I mean, you've probably seen Braveheart. So
Absolutely. And So there's some modern contextualization here then with the fact that people would use theater as this almost escape from the daily turmoils or the daily struggles of life, much like we do today, right? When we go to see a movie with our family, at least for that 2 or 3 hour span, we're less inclined to focus on the issues that are going on at home or at work, and we're more inclined to just focus on the entertainment value as like this pseudo escape. So it would make sense then that, Shakespeare and his compositions, Macbeth in particular in this time period, would be an escape from the turmoil of those battles between families and those territories. So that's very interesting insight for sure.
Absolutely, I agree.
Thank you so much for hopping on today to share your knowledge and add in some historical context to what we've been discussing over the past few weeks with this play. I really appreciate your time, and I know my students do as well.
Oh, it's my pleasure completely. And they're lucky to get this show. So thanks for what you're doing.
All right, guys, joining the conversation now is criminal defense attorney Jackie Clay. Jackie earned her Juris Doctorate of Law degree from Emory University School of Law, and she's licensed to practice in every state, municipal, and superior court in the state of Georgia, including the highest court in the state, which is the Georgia Supreme Court. Jackie, just want to thank you so much for being here to help us shed some light on the legal ramifications of what's transpiring in Macbeth in this play, and kind of what that would look like if these same crimes were committed in 21st century America. So let's start. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do, your area of expertise, and maybe if there are any exemplary cases that come to mind with what's been going on in the play and what you and I have discussed so far?
Sure. Well, first, I'd just like to say thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I specialize in criminal defense appeals, and I only do felonies. So my cases range anywhere from an aggravated assault all the way up to murder and everything between. So I get the really serious crimes. And since I only do appeals, all of my clients have actually already been convicted, which means instead of having the burden of proof be on the state to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody is guilty, I have the opposite burden where I have to show that their trial violated the 14th Amendment and that it was not fair.
Gotcha. Very cool. So can you shed some light on the 14th Amendment, what that means, what right is granted to people through that amendment? Because I think for this conversation, it would be safe for us to just assume that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth also garnered that right, since we're going to look at this from a contemporary perspective. So can you shed some light on what that means?
Certainly. The crux of the 14th Amendment is that everybody has what's called due process right. And this basically means that they can't just arrest you and throw you in jail without due process, which means you have the right to a fair trial. You have the right to an attorney and everything else that goes along with having a fair trial. You need an impartial jury. If you want to have a jury trial, you have the option to have a jury trial and things like that. But more importantly, what the 14th Amendment does is it allows the states, so each individual state has their own constitution. Georgia most recently ratified their constitution in 1983. So what it does is it allows the states, so like the state of Georgia, to adopt all of the amendments that are in the Constitution.
Gotcha. Okay. So if we're going to assume with what transpires in this play that they have that right to due process, let me kind of share some different things that happen throughout the play and maybe some evidence of things that are said. And then maybe you could shed some light on if that's something that you think would hold up in contemporary court. So initially, at the very beginning of the play, we've got this understanding that Macbeth is told this prophecy by these witches that are kind of manipulating his life. They're giving him these ambiguous riddles, and it's up to him to discern the meaning behind them. And it really demonstrates his character flaw as we continue to see the play develop, because he grows more and more arrogant in his kingship when he does usurp the throne and when he murders King Duncan. And so we see that level of arrogance begin to shift, whereas Lady Macbeth earlier in the play is much more arrogant and straightforward, and Macbeth is passive about the entire premise. We do see this character shift that transpires, and he becomes more candid and more blunt in not only wanting to maintain his power, but also in the way that he continues to interpret future prophecies by these witches. And so they tell him that essentially he is Thane of Glamis, and that's his current title. This area in Scotland, he is Thane of Glamis. And they tell him that he will become Thane of Cawdor, and ultimately that he will become king. And so he takes that information, once he does inevitably become the Thane of Cawdor, to be some facet of truth that maybe this is something that's actually going to happen. And so he writes Lady Macbeth a letter, his wife, a letter, and tells her everything that's going on. I met, as he refers to them, these three weird sisters that told me these things are going to happen. And her response to that letter is Glamis and Cawdor, and quote, "Thou shalt be what thou art promised." So she's setting this precedent early that she wants to make sure that that does in fact come to fruition. But she also cites something where she says that she fears that Macbeth, her husband, is too full of the milk of human kindness to quote, "catch the nearest way." And so interpretively, we've been talking about in with my advanced composition classes with my students that that is the nearest way is to have the king murdered or to murder the king. So ultimately, we've got this piece of evidence that could potentially be used in a literary analysis if they were to discern who is more responsible for the murder of King Duncan and that level of guilt. But then we start to see the conversations that happen between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and just for this the sense of argument, let's assume that someone were recording that conversation, or there were transcriptions rather of that conversation. He starts out by telling his wife, "If chance will have me king, why then chance will crown me without my stir." So in other words, chance made me the Thane of Cawdor. If chance will allow me to become king, then that's great. But the relationship between King Duncan and myself is one built on a mutual respect. He just helped him win this major war. He was just given this new title. And so as a result, he tells Lady Macbeth, I'm not going to do anything to try and garner the throne in a faster manner. And that is when she rebuts with, "What beast was it then that made you break this enterprise to me? Quote, when you durst do it, then you were a man." So is that sort of coercion something that you think would hold up in modern courts? And is it enough to where she could be deemed equally as guilty for the murder of King Duncan, even though she did not actually commit the murder Macbeth did? It is just those sorts of coercive statements. Is that enough evidence, you think, to support the notion that she is equally as guilty? And what would that look like in a modern court system? Maybe you've got some anecdotal evidence from some cases that you've either been a part of or you've read about. What would that look like, do you think?
Sure. And just to let you know, if I'm looking to the side, either I'm looking at a document that I made some notes for in advance to kind of help give me a reference, or I'm also taking notes as well.
Awesome.
So as I understand it, you're asking me essentially three questions. The first question being, are the statements that she made to Macbeth, are they enough to constitute coercion? And the short answer for that is no. When it comes to violent criminal acts, coercion is basically, when it comes to murder, coercion is never a defense. So you can't say somebody put a gun to my head and told me if I didn't kill this other person that they were then going to kill me. there are other defenses that might be more applicable, or other ways to kind of mitigate the responsibility of Macbeth, and that would be what we call provocation. And provocation typically isn't allowed to be words alone either. If you're committing a violent act such as murder, provocation is typically, if there's going to be words involved, it's going to be words and what we call menaces as well. So there's going to be words and actions that are going to be involved in that, in order for it to rise to be enough to mitigate, to make it so that it's not murder. But in the state of Georgia, we recognize murder in different ways. We have malice murder, which is essentially no good reason. I have a malignant heart. I'm angry at you, so I'm just going to pull a gun out and shoot you because, I don't like you. There's no justification. There's no viable reason. Then we also have what's called felony murder, which means if you are in the commission of committing an inherently dangerous crime, like say robbing a bank, and somebody dies, you can also be responsible for murder. Then we have kind of lesser included. It's called voluntary manslaughter and involuntary manslaughter. And this to me sounds a little bit more in line with voluntary manslaughter, because what you have with voluntary manslaughter is when one person kills another person, and normally it would constitute malice murder, but because there was some form of provocation, that's why you actually committed the crime. And Georgia defines provocation as, sorry, give me just a moment. I want to make sure I don't misquote it.
That's fine.
So they define provocation as an act which is the result of a sudden, violent, and irresistible passion resulting from serious provocation sufficient to excite such passion in a reasonable person. The most common example of this is when you have an unfaithful spouse. So when you have one spouse walk in and you're actually catching the other spouse in the act of infidelity, and then amidst that passion of seeing that act, you act in a way that you wouldn't normally act. But you can also have verbal and menacing provocation, which again is kind of a combination between words and actions. So if there were actions that were also involved with the words of, hey, you got to be a man, you're not doing what you're supposed to do, this is what fate says, then voluntary manslaughter seems like it would be more applicable than murder.
Gotcha. So after this particular scene, and thank you for those clarifications, I think those help tremendously. She does go into detail of how they intend to follow through with it. So if there were evidence that suggested that she were the one that premeditated how they were going to conduct the murder, does that change those circumstances at all, you think?
It does a little bit. So in the state of Georgia, premeditation is not a requirement for malice murder. However, if there's not premeditation, it can certainly fit in better with voluntary manslaughter or with felony murder. But with felony murder, the punishment is still the same as malice murder. Voluntary manslaughter as a lesser included, which just means, yeah, it's still a really bad crime, but it's not quite as bad as the other one, has a lesser sentence. But it sounds to me though, what you're talking about there is more along the lines of either an accomplice or an accessory. Now, an accomplice is somebody who helps you with the crime. So if they were working together and both people were present at the death, then that would be an accomplice. Whereas an accessory is typically not at the crime when it happens. So if you know about the crime in advance, well, let me back up just a minute, because I think the most common ways that we use accessory is an accessory before the fact and then an accessory after the fact.
Okay.
And an accessory after the fact would be me saying, Jeremiah, I want to go rob a bank. can I borrow your gun? And you saying, sure, here's my gun, go rob the bank. And then I go rob the bank. Now you clearly know what I'm going to do with the gun. And you actually aided me, you helped me in committing my crime by providing the gun to me. But you would not be an accessory if I said, hey, Jeremiah, I want to go to the shooting range. Could I borrow your gun? That's completely legal. Therefore, you would not be an accessory if that's how I had presented it to you.
Gotcha.
Then we've got an accessory after the fact, which is, hey, Jeremiah, here's this gun I just used to commit a bank robbery. Will you hide it for me? That's obviously I've just told you I've committed a crime and you're now helping me hide the crime. Whereas if I were to say, oh, hey, Jeremiah, would you mind cleaning my gun for me? Then obviously that's something that's legal. It's not going to put you in any position where you have done anything to aid. So it sounds to me, and this basically goes to the second question, which was who is more responsible? Because an accessory after the fact, just the same as an accomplice, can be charged with the same crime as the principal. And the principal is the person who actually does the shooting. So here, who causes the murder. And so here we've got Macbeth actually committing the murder, but he's doing it because he's getting told to. He's by the wife. The wife is saying, you know, hey, these are things that you need to go do. Here's a plan of how you can do it. So either I think most likely what would happen is they would either consider her an accomplice, which is the person who helps in the crime, or they would consider her an accessory. And she could be charged equally and be equally as culpable as the principal, or she could be charged, if she were charged as an accessory, she could be charged to a lower degree.
So that makes a lot of sense. And we talked about earlier in this particular unit, before we started reading this play, I gave students a few articles on the case in Georgia with Kelly Gissendaner, and she was the individual, most recent woman in Georgia to be executed. And she essentially hired her boyfriend, Gregory Owen, to murder her husband. And as a result, we were looking at, okay, well, who is more guilty, the person that committed the murder or the person that contributed and kind of instilled this plan to do it? And we had some pretty rich conversations about, you know, can you force somebody to do something they don't want to do only through the power of words? And so this accomplice to murder that you're bringing up, I think, is really, really important, because, you know, we talked about why did they get two different sentences? Well, ultimately, she was executed. Gregory Owen got life in prison with the chance of parole. And ultimately, that came down to he chose the plea deal. She did not choose the plea deal because she felt that she was not guilty. And as a result, they got two different sentences. But I think that sheds enormous light on what all of this means in regard to the power of words and how that would hold up in court. So thank you for those clarifications. I did want to ask you one other facet of this, if that's okay. We've been talking, and I just had Jonathan Henderson on. He's a social studies teacher of 25 years. He's traveled all over the world, and he's been teaching the subject for a very long time. And we had conversations about the supernatural and why Shakespeare would have embedded those supernatural and witchcraft-like elements within the context of the play. And would that, if we assume that that is strictly supernatural and just his imagination and what he is seeing, is that something that would aid in a potential insanity plea, where he could plead insanity, because ultimately this all stemmed back to the very beginning of the play, where these witches told him this prophecy, and as a result he acted on it. Is that something that you think would potentially be able to hold up if he had an attorney that would vouch for him and say, look, he acted based on these visions that he was seeing, in line with his wife coercing him to follow through with that? You know, this is really something that we should not be looking either for the death penalty with capital punishment or life in prison. You know, he needs help. How do you think that would play out potentially?
I think it's really interesting that you bring it up in a mental health scenario. So you can essentially take two positions for not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect. And one of them is that you're having delusions or compulsions that are essentially forcing you to do something. And then the other way that you can approach it is by saying, my mental illness is so severe that I didn't understand the difference between right and wrong at the time that I committed the acts. And it sounds to me like we're in the realm of delusions and compulsions, and then we've got an additional person who's on the side who's encouraging those compulsions. And I think that it would be an absolutely viable defense in today's world to say he was suffering from hallucinations. He was seeing witches or talking to witches, or supernatural beings were coming to him and telling him that this is what he needed to do. The problem with that defense, typically in my experience, is it's very difficult to convince a jury that the compulsions were so real, or appeared to that individual to be so real, that they had no other options but to move forward with it.
Gotcha. Yeah. Later in the play, and what's interesting is the evidence of that. How do you evidence that that's something that's actually happening? How do you justify and validate that that's really something that's happening? And early in the play, the only other person that knew about the witches would either be Lady Macbeth, who we know is coercing him to follow through with these things, or Banquo, who is, his sidekick almost. They're really good friends. They fight in battle together, and Banquo since has been murdered. Macbeth, to try and keep his throne, is suspicious of Banquo. He knows Banquo is suspicious of him. He knows that Banquo's prophecy from these witches was that thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. So in other words, he'll never be king, but his children will. So Macbeth hires 3 murderers to have Banquo and his son murdered as well. Fleance, Banquo's son, does get away, which leads to, some facet of truth with these prophecies. But ultimately, as he is trying to maintain his throne, he's continuing to do things that that are furthered criminal activity. And after the murder of Banquo, when he's in this gathering, he's having this feast with everybody, and his other noblemen and his wife, we see this very vivid depiction of Banquo's ghost sitting in his chair, and he starts to appear to have an out-of-body experience almost. He starts talking to this ghost, and Lady Macbeth is trying to cover for him. He's suffered from these things since he was a child. And a statement like that, do you think it could validate, since there were witnesses at that table, that it could potentially validate that, yeah, there is evidence that this is not made up just to try and get him out of the potential for the death penalty, but that this is something that he has in fact suffered with his entire life?
Absolutely. So for the most part, the way evidence works is you're allowed to call witnesses who can come in and testify to things that they saw. Now, a lay witness, which is going to be your regular, everyday, run-of-the-mill person, they can say, well, I saw him do this. And you can ask questions like, would that be out of character for this person to act in manner A or manner B or manner C? To get in any type of evidence about this specific compulsions or delusions, especially happening since childhood, the best way to do that would be to call an expert in and have an expert talk about the mental health problems, the history, have the expert do a interview, and all of those things are going to happen in real life. If you're using an insanity defense, the state's going to hire a witness to come in, or excuse me, an expert to come in and interview the accused, and then the defense attorney also is going to have, well, they should at least have one expert go in and do that as well. So that's one way to get the evidence. And another way to get the evidence in would be from the person themselves. and have them testify, this is what was going on, this is what I saw, this is what I thought at the time.
Gotcha. So we know we're right at this pinnacle moment with Act 5, where Macduff has just gone to England to get Malcolm, who's the rightful heir to the throne, and is bringing this army, and ultimately Macbeth, the prophecy that the witches gave him, he internalized it to literally, none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. He internalizes that to mean that I cannot be harmed, I'm invincible, when in fact they were trying to warn him that the Macduff was quote unquote untimely ripped from his mother, so he was not in fact birthed. And so ultimately Macbeth succumbs to Macduff, and is ultimately beheaded. So we, just to clarify, that this is all strictly hypothetical,
Sure.
but in an analysis and a literary criticism of these things that have transpired on stage, I really think you've given us a lot to work with in regard to what this would look like in an actual legal system. You've given some legal jargon that we can use, and I saw where you sent a glossary of legal terms as well that you had typed up for our students. So I just want to thank you for that as well. And ultimately, I think you've really shed light on this level of guilt, the power of words. It's been our overarching theme with this unit. And can you coerce somebody to do something that they wouldn't normally do? And it sounds like with criminal defense in regard to felony murder, words alone aren't enough, and there needs to be a little bit more. And so, based on your assessment, I think you've really helped elevate some evidence for my students to work with. Are they responsible for their own actions, or is it a result of fate versus free will? So thank you so much for coming on, and just appreciate your time more than you know.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you.